As you can see, I decimated my shelves for this. So I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and I hope I don't start crying at any point. What's up friends, my name is Jess, welcome back to my channel, and welcome to a video that's a little bit different and probably very long. Towards the end of the year / the beginning of the year, I always tend to get a little bit sentimental and reflective, and there are a few things that make me more sentimental than my books. I love my books. I love the entire collection that I have because I have loved reading, and I have been collecting these books specifically since I was a child. And I mean like kindergarten or younger, maybe even before I was born, since some of these books are hand-me-downs from my siblings. Which is all to say that I could practically tell you my life story with my books. And that's where this video came from. I decided to essentially walk you through my life from as far back as I can go to present day, only using the memories that I associate with my books, even if they're the most arbitrary things ever. This maybe sounds a little weird, but you'll see what I mean once I get started. When I look at my books, I don't just see books. I see hundreds and hundreds of little memories over the past 22 years that I associate with all of them. So I wanted to share with you a collection of those memories. So we're gonna start in first or second grade, somewhere around then, with Junie B. Jones. But not just any Junie B. Jones. I'm talking about a very specific Junie B. Jones book, a Christmas hardcover edition of Jingle Bells, Batman Smells. Now this is gonna be the only book that I talk about that I don't physically have. It's kind of a long story, but essentially when I moved to college, I didn't bring all of my books with me, and eventually, when they came back to me, there were a lot of books missing from my collection, and this happens to be one of the books that I just don't have anymore, and that makes me upset as is. But I just wanted to talk about this book really quickly because Junie B. Jones was such a big part of my childhood, and it was one of the series that I loved the most. This was the only hardcover Junie B. Jones book that I owned, and I think it might have been the only one that was ever put out in hardcover. It was so pretty, it was shiny, it had like the little ribbon bookmark and everything, and sadly enough, the memory that I associate with this is reading it in the bath, accidentally getting water on it, and then me being the brilliant first grader or whatever, trying to rub out the water and accidentally rubbing a hole in one of the pages. And then ever since then, I don't even know if I finished reading the book. I put it away and I tried not to look at it because I was ashamed. And that's maybe the last time that I tried to read in the bath. With the next book, we're still in first, second grade, and that's Kathy's Book by Sean Stewart. This is probably the coolest book that I ever owned, especially as a kid. You might be wondering why. It's because this book comes with a whole pouch of like props. For instance, in the book they start talking about a death certificate that the main character found. This is the death certificate. And there are a bunch of other stuff in here, including comics that the main character drew, a napkin with a lipstick mark, photographs that have been ripped up, a family tree, just a bunch of interactive elements that go along with the story. It's still cool now, so you can imagine how cool it was as a kid. And sadly, I made the mistake of lending this book out to someone, and I never saw it again. What's even more sad is that not only did I never see it again, but I eventually forgot the name of the book, and so I couldn't buy it again. It wasn't until late high school, early college years that I did a deep dive, tried so hard to find this book with the few details that I could remember, and I finally found it, and I got another copy, and no one's ever allowed to touch this book again. That's what I learned. With the first two books, I couldn't really remember if it was first or second grade, somewhere around that age group, but this book was definitely in the second grade. This is The Dragon Rider by Cornelia Funk. The memory that I associate with this is kind of embarrassing. Let me just set the scene for you. It's second grade. There's this boy who had a huge crush on me and had a crush on me for quite a while. I wasn't interested, but he had this book, and I was interested in this book. It looks so nice. I don't know if you can see it in the reflection, but it's kind of shimmery and gold, and there's a dragon on it, and I think there's a map on the inside. I don't know. It was just so cool, and I wanted to read it so badly, but I couldn't because it was his book. But he knew I was interested in reading the book, so he said that I could read it with him, and so spend time with him during the free period that we would have during my second grade class. So I played nice, and I agreed to do so. Eventually I got my own copy, but if that doesn't tell you about how highly I prioritize books and what I am willing to do to read the books that I want to read, I don't know what will. I so hope he never sees this. That's what I think of when I think of this book. We're really starting off this video with just about every mildly embarrassing childhood memory that I can think of, because the next one that I'm gonna bring out is The Sea of Monsters by Rick Riordan. And if you've been watching my channel for a little while, you know that I haven't read the Percy Jackson series. And you also probably know this is the second book in the series. And those two facts are related to each other. This is the only Percy Jackson book I've ever read. I don't know how it happened, but as a kid, I bought this book without realizing that it was the second book in the series, and I read it, and the reason that I never read the rest of the Percy Jackson series is because I had a problem with the pacing of it. And obviously I'm gonna have a problem with the pacing of it because this is the second book in a series, and I missed the entire foundation. I kept the book for a long time, intending to read the series eventually, but for anyone wondering why I haven't read the Percy Jackson series yet, this is why. The next thing I have is actually a comic. It is a Betty and Veronica comic, which is a spin-off, I think, from the Archie comics. This is the first book that has no embarrassing negative emotion connected to it. As a kid, my mom used to shop at Publix way more often than she did in the later years, and in the cash register lines at Publix, they usually had Betty and Veronica comics. So every time I would go to Publix with my mom and we would be in the line, I would inevitably pick up one of these comics and I would read them while things were getting rung up and my mom was paying. Occasionally I managed to convince her to buy me a couple of them. And now I have a whole collection of Archie comics. Now we're moving on to middle school with Christmas Cookie Murder by Leslie Meyer. I have mentioned this book a weird amount of times in videos lately. I think I've mentioned this at least in 2 other videos. And I've said it in all of those videos, but I'm gonna say it again, this objectively is not a good book. Warning is put out there. You decide if you want to read it or not. But the reason that they came up in other videos is because this is a book that I used to read pretty much every Christmas season. I don't know how many years. Eventually I fell out of the habit in high school, I think, but I would read it every year. I was obsessed with it. And this is actually the first memory I have of crime fiction. And crime fiction is a genre that I became obsessed with all throughout middle school and pretty far into my high school years too. So it's the genre that I have the most fondness for, probably. And I don't know if you can tell, but this cover, she's pretty battered, she's pretty frayed. I'm never gonna get rid of this book. My crime fiction obsession continued for many, many years, and it developed to the point where I was reading a bunch of non-fiction crime books, which leads me to I'll Be Watching You. This is a collection of actual cases revolving around stalkers, which is maybe a weird thing to have been reading as a middle school child, but I was just obsessed with it. And looking back on it, I can't believe that I read this thing cover to cover considering how dense it is, but I did, and I remember exactly where I was reading it too, because I have a very distinct memory of reading this on the couch at my grandfather's home during a family party. Now, if you don't know, I am Cuban, and like a lot of Latinx families, we had a lot of parties, and they would last a very long time. And, you know, as a child, they just weren't the most fun thing around. And I was always that person who brought a book to the family parties, and I've done this for years and years. I don't think I stopped doing that until I got to college, because I just wasn't interested and I was shy and I would have rather have just sat and read my book. So basically, while everyone else was partying in the backyard, I was sitting on the couch in very dim lighting, which is where my glasses came from early in life, reading about stalkers at like 12 years old. That's who I was. The next thing that I wanted to share, I'm pretty sure does not belong to me at all, and it is Inuyasha. I pretty much never talk about manga on my channel. It's not something that I read now, although I did used to read it a little bit back in the day. But this, absolutely without a doubt, does not belong to me. I'm so certain that this belongs to my sister. Like I mentioned, when I went to college, I left a lot of my books behind, and my mom, when she was packing up whatever books she had at her place to send them over to me, saw these and assumed it's a book, it must belong to Jess. And I just never said anything about it. I figured if my sister really wanted them back, she would realize they were gone and message me about it. In the meantime, I'll keep them safe. Out of me and my siblings, my sister was probably the one who enjoyed anime the most when we were growing up. And when we were younger, until around the time that I was 11 or 12, I think, my sister and I shared a room with bunk beds, which I'm sure she hated because she's 5 years older than me, so she would have been like 16 years old sharing a room with a middle school brat. So I'm sorry about that. But one of my fondest memories of sharing a room with my sister, and there are a few because we were sisters and we were catty. I do remember the late nights when animes like Inuyasha or Wolf's Rain or whatever would come on the TV, and my sister, because she was always loved those shows, would put them on and we would watch them together. And every now and then I remember that I would fall asleep before they came on and my sister would wake me up so that I could watch them with her. When I think of Inuyasha, I think of my sister, and I think of those nights that we spent watching it together. Eventually, if she ever wants these back, she's welcome to have them, but in the meantime, it's a nice reminder of her. And now we are on to 7th grade with The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I don't know if that's how you say it. I actually didn't really like this book when I read it. I remember reading it during lulls in class where I had finished the work early and I needed to occupy my time while waiting for everyone else, but I don't remember really enjoying it and I haven't read it since. But the reason that I read it in the first place is because my mom had told me that this was her favorite book ever, that she had read it when she was living in Cuba as a child. So I wanted to read it not because I thought I would enjoy the story or anything like that, but because it was a story that my mom enjoyed. So in my head, I would be reading the same words that she was reading, and I'd be able to learn a little bit about her and what her life was like as a child if I could find what it is that she enjoyed in this. And while I don't think that I enjoyed it, I do think that I know why she liked it. I'm never going to be able to think about this book without thinking about my mom and the fact that she loved it. And for that reason, even if I were to reread this and I were to decide that I don't actually like it, I'm never going to get rid of it. Unfortunately, the next book that I'm going to talk about doesn't have that familial relationship to save it, and that is Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I've mentioned this in other videos, but I hated this book. I hated it so much. Just to give you an idea of how much I didn't like this book. I was a very fast reader as a kid. I'm still a fast reader now, but as a kid in middle school, I pretty much had nothing else to do besides read, so I would go through books really, really quickly. And I was also vehemently against DNFing books. I was such a completionist. If I started a book, I needed to finish it. Even though I started this book and I hated it with a burning passion, I needed to finish it. And so a book that is very, very small ended up taking me a month to read, when normally I could have probably read this in a day or two. I recognize now that this story was just maybe too old for me at about 12, 13 years old, and maybe now I'll like it more. I am planning to reread it at some point, but my hatred of this book is so ingrained at this point that I look at it and I get just a little bit mad every time. For some reason, the most distinct memory I have of reading this was in my 7th grade science class, and I was holding the book like under the desk on my lap and reading while my science class was going on, which begs the question as to why I did so well in school if I was doing that, but I don't know, I'm a good test taker. On to happier memories though. In 7th grade, I started reading the Gone series by Michael Grant and I was obsessed with it. Realistically, that's probably the series that got me into YA books, but I just loved the series so much, and I ended up catching up with the publication of it. By that time, the first 3 books had already come out, and I read them, and I was waiting for the 4th one to come out. And that's what I have here. This was actually gifted to me by my best friend at the time for my 13th birthday, because this book came out 2 days before my birthday. Sadly, that best friend and I ended up drifting apart towards the end of our freshman year of high school, but this series is always going to make me think of her, and for some reason the rest of the series, each book also came out the same week of my birthday, so when I would get the next book and I would read it, I would inevitably think of her as well. So while we're not friends anymore, and it's kind of sad to think about the fact that we drifted apart, at the very least I have this gift from her, and I'm always going to remember that she cared enough about me and the things that I loved to go out of her way to get the 4th book in a series that I had told her I loved. Mind you, I don't even own physical copies of the first half of the series because this was the first Gone book that I owned, so I really should get them at some point. Okay, we're still in 7th grade. We're in my English class, and my class has started to read The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. Now, I'm already always going to associate this book with that 7th grade class, which is emotional enough as is because that class was the first time that I really felt like I had the ability and the passion to be a writer at some point in my life. But this book was also really special to me because it was the first time that I read something with an experimental narrator. If you've never read The Book Thief before, it is narrated by Death himself, or itself. So it was unique in that, and it kind of started my interest in finding books that are a little bit different, with unique narrators, reflective narrators, just narrators with a lot of knowledge and foreshadowing. And of course, The Book Thief is just an amazing book as is. I don't think I've reread it since 7th grade, and I definitely want to this year. Again, in 7th grade, a lot of things happened that year apparently. My grandma and I started going to the Miami Book Fair International, which is an annual week-long book fair that happens in Miami. During the week, you have a lot of different author events and special activities and things like that. And on the weekend, you have the street fair, which is just stalls upon stalls upon stalls of books being sold. And you have books that are being sold at full price, but most of the stalls have books being sold for cheap. You could thrift books for 50 cents at this place. And my grandma and I were obsessed with going to the street fair every single year. We have gone to the fair every single year except for 2017 because I had to do something for college during that specific weekend, and obviously 2020 because the fair was sadly canceled. But that means that we ended up going to the Miami Book Fair together for 9 years. And I am so unbelievably emotionally attached to the Miami Book Fair. Not only because I got cheap books there, but mostly because of my grandmother. Out of everyone in my family, she's the one who shares a passion for reading as much as I do. I don't know if I necessarily got it from her since it was my mom who was reading to me as a kid, but that's a thing that she and I share, and that book fair was an opportunity for us to connect and talk about all the books that we bought and get so excited about this passion together. And it was at this fair where I first learned about Isabel Allende, who is one of my grandma's favorite authors. This book, The House of Spirits, is the first Isabel Allende book that I ever bought, and I bought it at the street fair, I think in 7th grade, specifically because my grandma pointed it out and said that she loved that book. In a similar vein as The Little Prince, I was determined to read it because if my grandma said that she loved it, maybe I wouldn't love it, but I would definitely learn something about my grandma in reading it. Sadly, I tried to read this at around that age and it just didn't work for me. I had a really bad habit of trying to read books that were just out of my grasp, like out of my mental understanding. And so I put this book down and I didn't touch it for many, many years. But not only did I finally read this book in 2020, but I read the other two Isabel Allende books that I managed to accumulate, and you can bet that I mentioned it to my grandma when I called her. Now this next book, Pretties by Scott Westerfeld, is also associated with the Miami Book Fair. In 8th grade, I started reading the Ugly series. I didn't physically own the books myself, I was just borrowing the books from my English teacher and then obviously returning them after I was done. But at the time that the Miami Book Fair came around, I was in the middle of reading Pretties, and I discovered that Scott Westerfeld, the author, was actually going to be at the street fair that year signing books. So I decided when I went to the street fair that I was going to do something a little bit special for my English teacher, and I was going to get this book autographed for her so that it would be a cool thing for her to add to her classroom library. Of course, considering the fact that I'm holding this in my hands, you can tell that it didn't go the way that I thought it would. I brought the book to her with the autograph and everything, and she ended up telling me to keep it because she thought it was a special thing that I did and that I should have the opportunity to keep the memory. So here it is. This is the only book in the Ugly series that I own, and it is the second book in the series. Am I planning at any point to get the rest of the books? Not really, so this is just gonna be an anomaly on my shelves, besides the fact that I only have the second book of the Percy Jackson series. Whatever. That same year, my brother ended up joining the Marines, and he was the first sibling to leave the nest. It was pretty hard emotionally, because out of the entire family, my brother was definitely the liveliest one. He was the loudest one, he was the one that was always joking. We missed him a lot. One year for my birthday, I don't know if it was in 8th grade, I don't know if it was a little bit after, but at some point, my siblings asked me what I wanted for my birthday, and I told them, just give me a book that meant something to you, a book that you really liked, just a book. Pick out a book for me. And the book that my brother chose was The Few and the Proud, a collection of stories from Marine Corps drill instructors. This is probably the most out-of-character book that I have on my shelves. I did read it cover to cover, regardless of the fact that I don't think I'm ever gonna read it again, and this isn't a subject that I am really interested in. Again, I'm never gonna get rid of this book, because my brother picked it out for me with the thought that this meant something to him, and so he wanted to share it with me for my birthday. And I can tell that it meant something to him because this was already a used book. It's worn in before it ever came to me. So just like every other book on this list, I don't necessarily cherish it for its actual content, but I cherish it for the people that I remember when I think of this book. And now I'm starting to get a little emotional, and it's only going to get worse because we're moving on to high school, and what that means is that we're moving on to romantic relationships that have happened over the years. In my high school memories, the first book that mattered was Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Now, of course, there is the disclaimer that I don't support J.K. Rowling or her transphobic views. The Harry Potter books that I have are all either thrifted or they are gifts that I've had for many, many years, and she no longer gets any of my money. J.K. Rowling's views aside, though, I can't erase the fact that Harry Potter had a huge impact on my life, and I associate it with a lot of important things. Now, here's why this specific book, specifically the fourth book in the series, is so important important to me. This is the book that I was reading when I met the girl who would later become my first love. It's a bit of a funny story, actually, that takes place during my freshman year of high school. We had technically already met before because we had a couple of classes together, but we never really spoke, we never really acknowledged each other. We just ran in different circles. Now, in the spring semester of my freshman year of high school, I decided to do a reread of the entire Harry Potter series for the first time since I read them as a child. And just before I started this book, I think, I actually ended up getting my first boyfriend, who's actually kind of irrelevant to my life story besides the fact that if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have met her. We actually first started talking to each other seriously because she was in the same friend group that he was. Fast forward to the summer and the boy and I have broken up, but this girl and I are still talking. We actually ended up exchanging phone numbers on the last day of school, and the thing that we bonded over was Harry Potter and our love for reading. That was what we bonded over, and it built a beautiful friendship that eventually became a first love. And over the years we've exchanged a few books as gifts, obviously, because that's a thing that we both love, but I'm only gonna point out one, which is The Merciless by Danielle Vega. And the reason this is the one that I'm pointing out is because I actually already had this book when she ended up giving me this as a birthday gift, I think. Maybe it was Christmas, I don't know. But she ended up giving me this, and I immediately got rid of the paperback version because this was so much more important. This one was gifted to me by a friend versus one that I bought for myself. Which, mind you, is kind of the message I try to get across to my family and friends when they say that they're worried about buying me books as gifts, because I'm like, why would you be worried about that? If you end up giving me a duplicate, the book you give me is going to be so much more important. It's going to mean something more. But whatever. By the time she gave me this book, she and I had already broken up. It didn't work out. We weren't meant to be together so much as we were meant to be friends. So we're still friends to this day. But at the end of the day, she is always going to be my first love, and these are always going to be books that I associate with her and with that time in our lives. Now on to something a little bit less romantic. House of Leaves by Mark C. Danielewski. During the summer of 2013, I got my hands on this book and I decided to read it. Here's the thing though, if you haven't heard of House of Leaves before, this is a horror book, but it's a horror book that really gets into your head. Not just the story, but the entire way that it's formatted. Because the formatting starts to get a little weird. You start getting pages like this, or like this. It's weird, it gets into your head. And I was exclusively reading this book late at night, and I'm talking past midnight, up to like 4 in the morning, at a time where everyone in my house was asleep. And on top of that, the author's sister produced an entire soundtrack meant to go along with this book, and you can bet that I was listening to it while I was reading this. This is all to say that I essentially lost my mind during the summer of 2013 while I was reading this book. I wanted to get sucked into this story. I kept hearing things about it, I kept hearing that it was scary, that it would trip you up, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna go for it. I want to get tripped up. I wanted to play with my brain. So I even kept a journal to keep notes, to try to riddle out the mystery of this story. And I got what I wanted. I kind of lost my mind. And I can't look at this book now without still feeling a little bit of fear, a little bit of dread. And I haven't read it since 2013, so I'm actually due for a reread of it. Now this next book is Berlin Game by Len Dayton, and this is probably the weirdest memory to me, just because I can't fit it into my timeline. I don't even remember buying this book, and I only remember reading it in one place. A hospital waiting room. I don't really remember feeling sad or panicked, so maybe we were in the waiting room for like a good thing, but I don't know. And the mysterious thing to me is I asked my mom about it, if she remembered us being in a waiting room at around this time in my life, and she doesn't remember either. So why were we there? Were we actually there, or is that a memory that I made up? I don't know, but I have a distinct memory of reading this in a hospital waiting room, and I will never have the answers to that. The next book is Only Human by Gareth Roberts. Yes, this is a Doctor Who book, but it's a special Doctor Who book because it's a special edition for the 50th anniversary. The 50th anniversary for Doctor Who did take place in the later half of 2013, and at that time, my first love became my first girlfriend, and we were both super obsessed with Doctor Who. So we both did watch the 50th anniversary episode and live texted each other at that time, and I ended up getting this book. I think they ended up putting out one book for every Doctor, but I got this one specifically because, as far as I'm concerned, the 9th Doctor is my Doctor, so. And now we're moving on to around the time that I start my slow descent into Bookstagram and Booktube and everything like that. It's like January 2014, I think, and at this point I've already discovered BookTube and I'm obsessed with it. I wasn't doing any videos yet, I didn't have any plans myself for making my own channel, but I did write my first book review and it was for The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. Mind you, this is also one of my favorite series ever, and it's also proof that my crime fiction obsession was still continuing at that time, but this was the first book I reviewed, and this book was my first attempt at Bookstagram. Splintered by A.G. Howard. From what I can remember, I didn't actually like this book, but I was obsessed with the cover. So when I decided that I wanted to give Bookstagram a shot and I was starting to take a lot of different pictures of my books, this one was definitely one of the first ones that I took pictures of, and I actually really liked how the pictures came out. I don't really know where they are anymore. I hope that I have them saved somewhere, but I could not tell you. And in 2014, I think around the start of the summer, I'm not sure, I actually tried to do a BookTube channel for the very first time. I filmed videos for it and everything. And City of Glass by Cassandra Clare was actually one of the very first videos that I ever filmed. I think I did actually post a couple of those videos on YouTube, but eventually I took them down. I don't know, because I wasn't committing, because I didn't like the content, because I was too shy, whatever, pick a reason. But that attempt went nowhere. Even so, I do remember that this is, technically speaking, the first book that I talked about on BookTube. Moving away from BookTube for a moment though, at the end of 2014, I read the Game of Thrones series for the very first time, and the only time. Yes, I am aware that this is the second book in the series, but the first book in the series is all the way in the back of my bookcases, and I just don't feel like grabbing it. Now, as you can see, these are pretty big books, they're pretty chunky books, they're dense too. But I was determined to read the entire series before watching the show. And on top of that, I was determined to finish the entire series by the end of the year, which means that I actually read all 5 books in about the span of 2 months maybe, and that's a lot. I finished the 5th book, the final book, on December 30th, and I was exhausted because I was pushing myself so hard to make sure that I would finish the entire series, and I managed it. I'm proud of myself. Will I ever read this series again? Probably not. It's so long, it's so much. Now by that time, like I mentioned, my girlfriend and I had already broken up, and I actually had a new boyfriend. And for my birthday in 2015, he got me Alice in Wonderland, this very pretty copy. We broke up not too long after, and it does feel kind of weird that I kept this book, to be honest. But you know what? I lent him World War Z before we broke up, and I never got that back, so I don't feel too weird about it. Besides, this is just such a pretty copy, and it has silver edges, and it's just so pretty. But yeah, you can almost track my entire romantic history through my books as well, which is kind of a little weird, but we're here. While in high school, I also lent my sister my copy of Jane Eyre, and I didn't actually see this book again for quite a while. Like I mentioned, when I moved to college, I left my entire collection of books at home, and I didn't get them back until right before senior year, and during that time, my entire collection moved several times between several different hands, and by the time they got back to me, quite a few books were missing. Jane Eyre was not missing though. I did eventually get her back. And you know what? I don't think my sister ever finished that book. She did leave pressed flowers inside, so that's cute, and I'm gonna leave them in there for the rest of forever. Now during my freshman year of college, I actually had Bookstagram attempt number 2. It was a more serious try this time, mind you, and I did actually get involved with people a little bit, and I even had my first and only book exchange where I ended up getting Across the Universe by Beth Revis. But that Bookstagram attempt did fail. Fast forward to my sophomore year of college, and I have just started dating my current boyfriend, and at some point we go on a date to watch the movie Annihilation. Unfortunately, I was exhausted and I kept nodding off in the movie theater, so I would have already been confused, but Annihilation in general is a confusing movie, so it was a complicated time. So I decided to read the book Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer to try to get some answers. Did I get any answers? Not a lot, not really. But I have the book, and I read it. And at the end of that year, during winter break in 2018, my boyfriend and I and a few friends flew to Europe. Obviously, I needed a book to read during the flight, so I took the entire Crazy Rich Asians series by Kevin Kwan. I finished the first book on the plane, I finished the second book while we were in London, and I finished the third book when we were in Amsterdam. And speaking of Amsterdam, while we were there, we went to the Van Gogh Museum where I bought Van Gogh's Ear by Bernadette Murphy. Van Gogh is actually one of my favorite painters, so I was so glad that we got the opportunity to go to the museum, and even more glad that I bought this book because it's actually a pretty interesting nonfiction book about Van Gogh and his life all the way leading up to the ear incident that everyone knows. While we were in Amsterdam, my boyfriend and I actually celebrated our first anniversary, but he didn't give me my gift until we were back in the States. Because I still didn't have my books back and I didn't have my bookcases back, I was pretty sad and I missed having books around, so my boyfriend ended up buying me my small bookcase, which is behind the camera right now, and on that bookcase was a copy of Illuminae. And that's the end of the lovey-dovey portion of this video, I promise. Because the next book that I'm gonna mention is Winter by Marissa Meyer. This was the first book that I finished in 2020, and I read it at my mom's house while I was there for winter break, specifically for New Year's. This series, starting with Crest, was actually the first time that I ever tried tabbing up books, so it's special to me for that reason, but Winter specifically brings back memories to me of being the first one to wake up at my mom's place and going to the couch when it's all cold and quiet and just getting snuggled up in the blanket and probably with my mom's dog, and reading this book in the peace and silence. And it was just a very peaceful time to me. And of course, that holiday break was the last holiday that I spent with my mom, considering the pandemic happened a couple months after. There's also that memory to associate with it, but that's a sadder memory. Fast forward a bit and we're in quarantine. It's my last semester of college and I'm taking a podcasting class. I decided to do my podcast around books, and I managed to rope a couple of my friends into reading The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee with me. After all of us read this book, we ended up coming together later and having a discussion about it, essentially like a little mini book club. Not only am I so thankful that they took the time out of their busy schedules to read this book for me and talk with me later, but this was also pretty much the first buddy read I've ever had. And now we're almost caught up to present day. The very last book that I'm going to talk about is Bowl of Heaven by Gregory Benford and Larry Niven. I hated this book. It was so bad, but it's also the first book that I technically talked about on this channel, so thanks to this book. And now we're caught up to real life. I hope y'all enjoyed this trip down memory lane. I hope it wasn't boring for any of you. There were so many memories that I didn't share because just about every book on my shelf has a memory associated with it, but these were just the books that I felt would be essential to telling you my life story and where I've come from and where I am now, without getting into the very personal details, obviously. Like I said, I was just feeling reflective. I just really love the way books can mean so much more to people beyond the story that's inside of it. That's why I did this video, and if any of you are interested in doing a similar thing for yourself, you know, going through the books that meant something to you through your life, feel free to do it, and if you do it, make sure to DM me on Twitter, comment on this video, whatever, because I would love to see it. And if you aren't yet, make sure to subscribe to my channel. I have so much more content planned for you, and I am so excited for each and every video idea that I have, so I'd appreciate if y'all were there for it. And in the meantime, I'm gonna let y'all go so that I don't start crying on camera from all of these memories that have been brought up, and I will see you in the next one.